well, I'm going to defend a more aggressive theory than I maybe actually believe, just to be provocative, and say that the most visual art, the most non-linguistic glories of human culture are all actually dependent on, even parasitic on language. That if it weren't for the words that are behind all cultural transmission in our species, we couldn't have non-verbal cultural transmission in a big way. But first, let's look at some other. It's not that words aren't the only sort of digital means. I talked a little bit in Breaking the Spell about some, as it were, mimetic inventions of human culture which are sort of independent of language. If you look around the world and you look at dance, you find, well, first of all, how many of you know what Laba notation is? Laba notation was the attempt by a French choreographer, I think in the early 20th century, to come up with something like musical notation for dance. So it was an attempt to create a score so that a choreographer could write a score, and this would be a way of recording the dance. It was brave and brilliant and wonderful and a complete failure. I remember many years ago I had a student who was a dancer who wanted to try to invent a better alternative to Laba notation. I said, go for it, but I find it very difficult. And actually he abandoned the project when I said, look, if you really want to do this right, you should realize how high the standard has to be. In American baseball, the pitchers have many different pitches. There's this curveball and the slider and the knuckleball and the fastball and various, maybe half a dozen different pitches. And of course, the pitchers try to conceal which pitch they're throwing until the last possible instant. But a good trained baseball player or commentator, viewer, can see without any difficulty what pitch the pitcher is throwing. And so if you can come up with a notation that can capture that visible difference, then you've really got something. But if you think about it, you realize that's very, very difficult to do. Or just the difference between 4 or 5 different signature backhands in tennis or something like that. The space of possible dance moves looks very analog. And so because it looks very analog, it's very hard to digitize. But of course, folk dances, they digitize. Whether it's square dances in America or contra dances, there are a finite set of moves that you learn, and everybody learns them. And that's how the dances are transmitted. And the variations between the individuals sort of wash out. They don't count. There's many different ways of doing the do-si-do or the promenade or something in square dancing. And you can invent local variations on it. But the underlying move is there is a sort of norm of correction. This is how you recognize it. So it's digitized. Now nobody dreamt up, nobody appreciated the rationale of that. Nobody designed that. Evolution designed that. Because the dances that weren't digital couldn't be transmitted. So the fitness of the dance move derives from the digitization process, which makes it transmissible. And I mean, that's only part of the fitness, of course. So now we see, now that's not language, but it gives you a digitized base for combinatorial explosion, and creates the groundwork for a tradition that can be transmitted with high fidelity over many generations. Another really nice feature of this is that you get von Neumann multiplexing for free. The reason that our laptops work so super reliably is because at various points they have redundancy, where they have at least 3 versions of a signal, and they use a majority rule principle to correct errors that arise, because von Neumann realized that you can get indefinitely reliable transmission with indefinitely unreliable elements, as long as you put these vote takers in the middle every now and then to absorb the error. That's von Neumann multiplexing. That's why you can have a ritual in a religion. Nobody has to remember it perfectly. Because if they keep performing it, and so the recurrence of the performance is really important, but they have to do it in unison, they have to do it as a group. And that way, anything that you forget, your neighbor will probably remember, and you keep refreshing your memory of the ritual from the majority rule of the participants. So the whole group can keep the ritual constant from year to year to year, in spite of the fact that nobody has a perfect memory of how the ritual is done. Another example of digitization playing a role in cultural transmission. Now, it's very true to say that, and we've moved beyond that. We have high culture now, where we glory in the parts of the arts that are not like folk dances, that are not like simple rituals, and we extol the most original, non-rote, non-formulaic aspects of art. But I submit that all of that is parasitic on the underlying capacity of culture to be formulaic. Because in formulaic culture is the backbone is the wrong metaphor. It's the formulaic aspects of culture that's the DNA of culture that permits it to build over the generations.
Well, after all, I'm not that generous. I can't resist to make a statement right now. And I like to order you in terms of the question we are discussing here, between 2 extremes. One, it would be the social biology, which says, well, morality is just an illusion. And I think it's too much reductive to biology than it should be. And the other extreme would be people like Pinker, and I almost quote, we can do with language almost everything we want. That would be too much. So we are in the middle of this. We are, of course, animals, and we evolve, but our beginning is exactly the same simple being as any other living being on the earth. But it strikes me that the explanation, when it comes to explain how it comes, language plays a very important role. And I think, well, if we think when we start to talk with each other, it was very recently in our history. So what was behind that? And we must have been interacting in a very intense way and without words. So I miss the gap. And so I ask you, what would you think could fill this gap? My guess is we have to trust more on affections and empathy and things like that. What do you think about it?
Well, first, let me say that I agree with you that sociobiology got us off on a bad start in some ways. Not because there's some brilliant stuff in it, but Ed Wilson's an ant expert. If he were a bird expert, then I think there would have been a lot more, people would have come out being a lot more like birds than they are. He's a sweet guy and he has many wonderful ideas, but he did, his enthusiasm distorted his message, and a lot, but by no means all, or by no means even the bulk of the criticism of sociobiology was deserved. I think, again, a lot of it was hysterical and unfortunate, and the role of some of his colleagues in caricaturing it and ridiculing it was, I think, dishonest and ignoble. And I think that Ed stood up to that ignoble and dishonest attack with great grace and dignity. So I think it's very important to realize that. I think it's simply shocking what his colleagues, what Gould and Lewontin and a few other people did to try to destroy his reputation, and I think it is wonderful that his reputation survives quite handsomely in spite of their really concerted efforts to make him a pariah, which he certainly is not. But I think he overstated the case. And, surprise, surprise, because he did not appreciate the role of human culture in grounding so much of what's important. But you want to say that emotional attachments and bondings, which are pre-linguistic and are, in some sense, more basic in language, play a big role. And I think that's right. Although, interestingly, it means, in a way, playing back into the hands of sociobiology. It means that there's something they're right about. It's part of our animal nature. It's not just culture. It's part of our animal nature. It's part of our mammalian heritage, or even our vertebrate heritage that we really have to encounter. Well, who has a lot to say about this in the history of philosophy? Well, Hume, who talks about the natural virtues and the artificial virtues. The natural virtues are the ones that we get basically as part of our animal heritage. He didn't quite have Darwin's vision. Got very close, but the idea that our emotional attachments to our young and to our family, to our friends were primordial was right there, and he had a good account of it, and he had a good account of how culture then comes and is a a corrected but also an exploiter and an enhancer of those instincts for good. So we have Kant, who says, it's amazing that we can make such straight timbers from such gnarled wood. Kant stressing the sort of importance of culture and taming the beast. Then you have others saying, no, we're born good-natured. Most recently, Frans de Waal, the Dutch primatologist, his book Good Nature, who likes to stress the extent to which there is a sort of proto-morality in chimpanzees. I think Frans de Waal is telling a very, very one-sided story. He tends to downplay and overlook the viciousness that has also been very well recorded among chimpanzees in the wild. They're not as wonderful, as good-natured as he wants to portray them. Not that he doesn't have his side of the story, and it's a good one. A deeper, I think, implication of the primordiality of emotions lies in the fact that this is what I've been working on the last few years with some of my graduate students. The way in which the computer between the ears, your neck top, the control system for your neck top is emotional, everywhere. Emotions and micro-emotions are the control signals that propagate through your brain. And this fundamentally changes the architecture. When you think, if you look at the history of artificial intelligence, you look at the history of computational neuroscience, you see that one of the features that has been routinely imported from computer science, from programming, from the design of hardware, is the idea of hierarchical systems of subroutines with a high level of control, which is in a certain sense dictatorial. I can go way back to a book that fascinated me when I was a beginning graduate student, Miller, Galanter, and Pribram, Plans and the Structure of Behavior, with its famous tote units, test, operate, test, exit. Does that mean this is archaeology of cognitive science here, back in the 60s. So, most of the software that you are familiar with, all of the software that you are familiar with, is organized like an ideal corporation. There's the CEO level and the vice presidential level. And then there are the people down in the basement that take their orders, and they're sort of slaves, and everybody does his job. Reports to his superior, reports to his superior, reports to his superior. And there's nothing like that in the brain. Absolutely nothing like that in the brain. The brain is organized from semi-autonomous, often conflicting, anxious, selfish little robots. And there's tremendous waste motion, there's a lot of conflict, there's a lot of competition. And out of all of that political chaos, order, grace, ingenuity, brilliance, reflective capacity, all of that has to emerge from the sort of quasi-political infighting of all of these elements. And that's all the medium in which all of that is negotiated is neuromodulators. This is micro-emotions. This is the only way I can hold your attention now is by enlisting some of those armies in your head to beat back the competition and pay attention to me rather than all the other things that you could be paying attention to. And you can't, there's no level in your brain which says, I am going to pay attention to this now. You know that, you know, because when you try to do that, it doesn't work. So the level of, I mean, this wonderful vision that we get from Descartes, from philosophers generally, but also from psychologists, of this beautifully organized, rational mind. We have to realize that that's a temporary, ephemeral achievement. When everything is going just right and we get all the bickering to stop, we can marshal, the forces can marshal themselves, because there's no I in there that's doing it, to get us to concentrate on a particular task and get it done. And there's no traffic cop in there. There's no king. There's no dictator. There's no CEO that makes it happen. It's an unruly democracy at best. And that's where emotions are really fundamental, and the rationality that we do achieve, and we do, is, it's a balancing act. It's like a circus performance. We manage to pull it off when everything's going just right.
Thank you. Now we have room for some questions. I will just beg your attention to 2 points. First, to present your questions in a way that everybody in this room can listen to it, including Professor Dennett naturally. And second, please, to do this as a question, not as a new lecture.
He was stuck here 2 months ago.
No, sorry, all right. Hyper-optimism, for sure. Kurzweil thinks that Moore's law, the explosive increase in speed and drop in cost and so forth of computing power is going to lead to a point where not just artificial intelligence equivalent to ours is possible, but AI plus super intelligence will then follow. And once there's super intelligence, which is more intelligent than we are, then there will be super duper intelligence, and we have this singularity, this moment, and we can't predict beyond that. It doesn't stop him from fantasizing about this moment, which he thinks will happen soon. I recently heard this described as the rapture for nerds.
Right. Yes.
Which I think is right, exactly right. If you're not religious, you're a nerd, then this idea can really fascinate you. I think no, I'm as pessimistic as before. I think that Kurzweil and Hans Moravec and the other people who've been thinking about this, I think they're driven by their enthusiasm for the ideas to ignoring the huge practical problems that are not being solved and show no signs of being solved because, as you say, we don't know how to think in parallel. And in fact, balancing Moore's law is, I don't know if there's a name for it, but there should be, somebody should articulate a law which says that, let's see if we can formulate it roughly, right? It's not a power law, I don't think, let's see. But the inefficiency of code grows faster than Moore's law growth, so that my current laptop is, I guess, maybe 1,000,000 times faster than my first portable computer, which was a CPM 8-bit machine back in the early 80s. But calling up a file takes longer today than it did then. Yeah. Now there's good reasons for that. Back in those early days, it was horrifically easy just to lose a file into the ether, and it's gone for good. And a lot of the time that we waste now is making all sorts of automatic backups so that you can back out of mistakes that you couldn't in the old days. But still, that's just the trivial surface of this. I think that the idea that we're going to solve the AI problem by explicit coding is simply a joke. It's a joke on the order of magnitude of, come on, gang, let's do our nanotechnology and let's build a gallbladder atom by atom. Forget it. It's not going to happen. Yes, a gallbladder is just a very complicated structure of atoms, but you're not going to build it piecemeal with nanotechnology, and you're not going to build artificial intelligence the way Doug Dennett thinks with Sight or a system like that. Now the Turing test. Here I think that some of you will remember that back in the 80s when AI was really a big enthusiasm, the British chess expert David Levy made a wager with 3 of the leaders of the AI movement, Herb Simon, John McCarthy, and Marvin Minsky. And the bet was that within N years, I can't remember exactly when, how many years it was, the computer chess program would beat the world champion. And it was not an insignificant wager. It was like $10,000 each, some fairly large amount of money. And of course, David Levy won the bet. And so the 3 giants had to pay off. It was a bit embarrassing. But they were wrong by less than a decade. And what they had counted on was that people were going to keep working on chess. And in fact, for most of those years, during when the bet was on, there was hardly any research going on. Then IBM kicked in with Deep Blue, and sure enough, their prophecy came true, but too late to win the bet. Now, I think something like this is a lesson for whether or not we're going to have something that passes the Turing test. Nobody's trying to write programs that would pass the legitimate open Turing test. The Loebner Prize is a joke. Someday maybe I'll write my account of the early days of the Loebner Prize. It was quite a comical adventure. I dropped out. I was the chairman of the prize committee for a number of years, right from the beginning. But it was the behind-the-scenes problems are very amusing, actually. But I guess that's still going on. But it's the programs that compete are just not to be taken seriously. They're clever, but that's not real AI. So I don't think Kurzweil's vision, I don't think the Turing test is going to be passed fair and square in my lifetime for a rather boring reason. It would cost billions or trillions of dollars and use a lot of the best minds, and there's better things to do. And we're going to use AI research to understand how minds work, but we're not going to make the mind. That's not the way science works, nor should it. We're going to do proof of concept. We're going to do toy problems. We're going to work things out and leave all the fine-grained details that you have to have in there to have genuine, reflective, conscious machine thought. Do I think it's possible? Sure, I think it's possible. But I don't expect it, as I say, in my lifetime. Compare it with this. Would it be possible to build a robotic bird that could land on a twig, fly around in this room, and catch insects in its beak on the fly? I don't think there's anything miraculous about a bird. I think we know exactly what that task would involve. I don't think anybody would expect this in their lifetime. The micro-miniaturization, the power requirements, it's a colossally difficult robotics job, and who would pay for it?
And physical constraints also. And physical constraints also.
Exactly. I mean,
this guy of the nanotechnology, he doesn't know physics. So he believes in this small universe you can counteract all the adsorption and interactive force. It's impossible. So you can build a nanorobot, a real one.
well,
Not in the sense that he imagined little machines.
a bird is a marvel of technology, and it almost certainly exploits sort of engineering principles near the edge of optimality. I mean, not only are its bones about as light as they could possibly be, hard to replace them with, graphene. I suppose that's what you use, but the efficiency of the computations in its brain and the size of its brain probably pretty well optimized. So probably the only way you could really do that is by mimicking nature at the cellular level or at the subcellular level, and that's just, forget it. But that's probably also true of artificial intelligence. I have a postdoc right now who's just finished a PhD in neuroscience at MIT, and her dissertation was on astrocytes, which I have to say, before I brought her on as a postdoc, I hardly knew what an astrocyte was. How many of you know what astrocytes are? They are brain cells. They're glia. We used to think of them as just sort of little pillows that protected the neurons, provided some metabolic support or something. They were the packing that protected the brain. Oh no. Turns out they're quite intelligent, have long astrocytes, sort of star-shaped, and they compute. And there's roughly 10 times more of them than there are neurons. Oh my goodness. The brain just became orders of magnitude more complicated. Probably just having a really good model of 200 or 300 billion neurons is going to be much too simple.
Professor Jack. Please, louder.
So
Would like to use the microphone?
No, no. I wonder if you could comment on free will and you know, this new exciting experiments from neuroscience that says that decision making is just illusion, a posteriori perception.
Oh, I'm so glad you asked that question because it's been a major concern of mine for the last year or so. There's been just a flood of pronouncement in the press from neuroscientists and from people working. Micah Zaniga has his neuroscience and the law workshop, and that's generating a lot of stuff. And I think a lot of it is lamentably confused. And I think it's a case where scientists who are too impatient with the philosophers to even listen to their critiques are blundering around and saying things that are really unfortunate. And the reason it's unfortunate is that what people think about free will really makes a difference. That's why people are worried about, stop that crow, and why they would prefer to have a sort of veil of ignorance drop down over all of this, because they're afraid, what if people find out that there's no free will, then won't people's attitudes towards morality, towards their own responsibility, won't they change? And there is some evidence that that's true. Jonathan Schooler and Catherine Bose have done some experiments that are quite disturbing. They did an experiment in which subjects, this is typical college student subject, they read a passage actually from Francis Crick's book, The Astonishing Hypothesis, which says, basically we don't have free will. Now we understand how the brain works, we don't have free will. And they're given some little test on comprehension of that, but that's just to set them up. The control group reads a passage also from Crick, but it doesn't say anything about free will, and it doesn't have that implication. But then the two groups are given another task, and it's subtly done in such a way that they will all discover that due to a flaw in the program, there's an opportunity to cheat. And if they cheat, they'll make more money. So the dependent variable is how much cheating do the two groups do. And the group that's read the passage saying there's no free will cheat significantly more. Well, laugh, but also worry. I mean,
Would you do the same with religion? The same
the same sorts of experiments are going on now. In fact, one of my other postdocs has been doing some work on justice, and he's got a paper coming out in the Proceedings of the Royal Society on his research on that. And there's others as well. I asked Schooler to do another experiment which used a passage that I wrote, where I took the Crick passage and just revised it to say that, in fact, what neuroscience shows is that if we're normal and healthy, we do have free will, in the sense that matters, to see if that would make the effect go away. There were some problems. They actually did that experiment. There were some problems with the way they implemented it. So that hasn't been published. But there's a research going on this. But in any case, I think research in a number of areas is showing that people, the worry that as we learn more about how the brain implements decision making, that this will diminish every man's sense of moral responsibility is a serious worry. And that's why I think it is on the edge of irresponsible for the neuroscientists who are doing the publicity of their research are presenting this as something they've established. They have not established it. Their experiments depend on crude oversimplifications and misconstruals of the issues. And I've been sort of on the warpath on this for many years, actually. Libet's experiments are the Benjamin Libet's experiments are the foundation for this work. They are, I think, seriously confused and on the edge of incoherence. And I have talks that I've been giving around trying to show exactly what is wrong with these experiments. There's a chapter in Freedom Evolves that deals specifically with Libet and the problems there. But that wasn't enough. I feel that I have to go and say it again louder and better and clearer. So what is wrong with that view? Perhaps the way to, since it would take me an hour to go through all the details, I'm not going to do that. But I'll give you sort of a challenge. Try to give an account of the Libet et al. Effects that doesn't presuppose that there's a place in the brain where you are, and you're out of the loop.
Yeah, right, yeah. And then you brought the
No,
message.
no, you're not out, you are the loop. And once you understand what that means, and here I sort of comical, I made a big mistake. The key insight, I think, into this whole issue is one that I expressed way back in 1984 in Elbow Room in a single sentence, the most important sentence in the book. And I made the stupid mistake of putting it in parentheses. That is, if you make yourself really small, you can externalize virtually everything. It was a sort of joke. But in fact, it's very serious. I mean, if you understand, if you look at somebody and say, oh, here's a decision maker, I'm going to look at his brain. Now I'm going to go inside and I'm going to find out whether or not the brain is making the person's decision before he or she does. You're already off on the wrong track, because there's a new book out called My Brain Made Me Do It. And what's nice about the title of the book is that it wears its incoherence on its sleeve. I mean, that sounds spooky. How about My Mind Made Me Do It? Isn't that what we want? Isn't that what having free will would be, to have your mind make you do it? But your mind is your brain. But if you think that your mind is sort of, as it were, just in one little corner of the brain, in one little place in the brain, at one little time in the brain, if you think there's a Cartesian theater in there, then you're going to make this mistake. And if you don't think there's a Cartesian theater, then you can't even formulate this as the problem that the neuroscientists see. So all of this research is a sort of closet emptier. It teases Cartesian materialist out of the closet encourages them to come forth and reveal that they're still thinking of the mind as the conscious mind, or as Libet calls it, the conscious function, as this sort of magical place, magical thing that comes in at some point in the process. And until it comes on the scene, it can't decide. And the funny thing is that Libet himself, there's a passage where he gives the whole thing away and doesn't realize it. Let me see if I can, I have slides that would do it very clearly. Okay. I think I can do a 5-minute version of the classic Libet experiment. First, let's practice. Everybody's going to be subjects in Libet. At some point in the next 5 or 10 seconds, I want you just to flick your thumb, please. But don't plan to flick your thumb. Just let the spirit move you at some point, and just spontaneously and without any planning, let your thumb flick voluntarily, starting right about now. I didn't see any thumb flicks.
You have to explain what it is.
Okay, I'll give you an example. Here's one. Here's another. Here's another. Okay, very simple act. Don't plan it. Mine weren't good enough because I had to give you an example quick. So, but I want you, so, all right, you have 10 seconds to do a thumb flick, but don't plan it. Just let it happen.
Oh no, I planned it.
Okay, time's up. That's the easy part of the subject's job. And it seems laughably easy. Without planning, issue was spontaneous. His was a wrist flick, but thumb flick. Now, I'm going to ask you to do it again, only this time I'm going to make the task a little harder, because I want you to watch this clock face. And I want you just to notice when you're conscious of the decision to flick your thumb, what position my hand is in when you notice that. Okay, start now. Okay, now, how many of you were able to do a spontaneous thumb flick while looking at the clock face? Oh, come on. Really? Well, now at least you understand the unnaturalness of the act. Now, retrospectively now, I ask you, for how many of you was my hand at the 3 o'clock position between 1 and 3, and how many of you here, and how many of you here? All right, so you get some data. And you have an EEG helmet on, so that what Libet did was he had subjects do a lot of these wrist flicks. And he had the synchrony of his clock face, which was going at about that rate. And he asked them after each test to tell, as it were, what the time the clock was when they consciously intended to flick. And then he noticed that the Luderdecke and Kornhuber and Decke Bereitschaftspotential, the readiness potential, was a clear signal which occurred about 350 milliseconds before the consciousness of the intention to flick, if you believe the subjects were able to do that. And let's suppose that he calibrated right for that. So now we have this 350 millisecond gap which looked ominous to many people because it looked as if your brain had decided to flick 350 milliseconds before you did.
So the interpretation was that the brain did, the zombie did it, and then send the message to the guy that's waiting there to.
Yeah. So that you somewhere in there
Yeah, right.
are almost out of the loop. The decision has already been made 350 milliseconds before you think you decide. It was made by your brain. My brain made me do it. Now, Libet then goes on to point out that all is not lost, because from the time of your consciousness to the actual flick, we got another 150 milliseconds. And so there's about 100 milliseconds, a window of opportunity for the conscious function to veto the decision.
Right.
But now we got 100th of a second, and this then led Ramachandran to say, making a nice joke, we don't have free will, but we do have free won't. But, funny, but, why would that be free? Because as Libet, this is where Libet acknowledges, he says, it's possible, of course, that in the case of a veto, that unconscious processes like the Brightshoff potential would predict that you were going to veto. And so it's not that the consciousness would be free. The whole thing is just a mess. And the thing that's amusing is that there are experiments now, but I think the world record now is the paper by Soon et al., which now shows that if you use trainable neural nets to look for patterns in the signal, you can identify, you can predict, in this paper, it's not just I'm going to flick my wrist, but I'm going to choose either A or B. There's sort of two buttons, left finger, right finger. And Soon has found a signal that can predict which button you're going to push 10 seconds
10 seconds, so that's impossible.
before.
That's hard to believe. That's really hard to
Let me tell you why I don't think it's hard to believe. Do you, wait a minute, I gotta tell him why it's hard to believe. You all know the game of rock, paper, scissors.
Right.
And you know that the best strategy, if you're going to play the game, is a random strategy. If you have any pattern in your moves at all, your opponent can find that pattern and anticipate it and win. How do you generate a random strategy? You don't know. You have to somehow get your brain to try. I mean, there's a process that you don't have any knowledge of that you set in motion. And of course it isn't really a random process, but whatever it is not introspectable by you. Well, now in the Soon experiment, subjects are in the same predicament. They have to make a random decision. And they're going to have to let something build up in their brains, something that they don't have any access to, tip that decision. And so they somehow succeed in doing this. That if you have the right equipment and you massage the data long enough, you can find some trace which gives you a better than coin flip way of reading not reading the minds, reading the brains. of your subjects, then you can predict these. Okay, it's interesting that it shows more the power of the neural network that analyzes the data.
Yeah, I believe that. What I said it was hard to believe is that I believe the experiments. It's hard to believe the conclusions. That actually the brain is working 10 seconds behind what you perceive.
Well, yeah, but it's not that as it were, that the brain is working. It's the brain is chugging along, and something that happened 10 seconds earlier is somehow being exploited at a later time to, okay.
Não, só fala bem alto.
What do you think that
Louder.
was the reason for the whole world to think that conscious is in a specifically point of the brain, not the whole brain?
Yeah, that's it. Why do I think that that's the sort of folk idea? I think for a very quite straightforward and reasonable reason. I'm a sailor. One of the problems that we sailors have when we race our boats is when we're on the starting line, and it's a lot of boats in the race, and the starting line is 250 meters long. If you're at the float end of the line and the committee boat is at the other end of the line, the starting signal takes a long time to reach your ears, the gun. Fortunately, there's a flag that goes up so that you can get a light, and you can get a light transmitted sign that the race has started, but the sound arrives considerably later, of course. Speed of sound is arrives where? At the observer. Where's the observer? Well, you get the idea that, gee, the light arrives here, and then the sound arrives here. Okay. But what? At the eye and the ear? Is that where here is? Well, you soon learn that no, just getting the light to your eye isn't enough. It's got to get processed in the visual system. Just getting the sound to the hair cells is not enough. It's got to be processed further. So you think, hey, if, as in fact, the sound is processed faster than the vision. Visual cortex works slower than auditory cortex. So then wait a minute, maybe some of that time is made up, and maybe we get synchrony. We have to know where it all comes together. Where in the brain does the soundtrack get put on the film? Now that seems to be, so far, just nothing wrong with that reasoning. But in fact, I think there is something wrong with the reasoning. It's moving a sort of ideal observer into a particular place inside the system where we have the idea that we've still got a well-defined direction inbound and outbound. But once you get into the tangle of the brain, inbound and outbound no longer mean the right things, because you've got lots of loops, you've got lots of re-entrants and so forth. And so once you recognize that the re-entrant circuits and all of these can interact, you can get effects very early or very late that there's no place where everything has to get before anything can be compared. And we know, for instance, that the limbic system can, using a very crude, fast, early analysis of visual signal, sound the alarm and get you into orientation mode and uh-oh, and start pumping the adrenaline before the scene is really identified. So once you get into the brain as a whole, you have to stop looking for the observer. The observer is the whole person for these reasons. But you can see why it's natural to think. And I think the reason it's particularly natural is, I mean, why do we think, this goes way back to my Where Am I piece, way back to brainstorm. Why do we think that we think up in here? It's not because our brain is in there. If our brain were in our chest, and you know, if the nerves all just went down and we had our brain down here, we wouldn't think we were thinking from here, we'd think we were thinking from here. Why? Because we're thinking behind the eyes and between the ears. It's like a periscope. And that's, I think, where the illusion of the Cartesian theater comes from.
We have one more question.
I would like to think with you about
Bettina, please slow down.
do you think that neuroplasticity is a way for transmission of culture also? Do you think it may be? What's your point of view about neuroplasticity?
Well, neuroplasticity, we couldn't have the EVM, the English virtual machine, or the RCVM, that's the Roman Catholicism virtual machine, and so forth. All of these cultural structures, of course, can only get installed in a brain that has neural plasticity of a very high order. It's the programmability of our brains, the fact that if we can download all of these thinking tools and thinking toys and thinking distractions so easily, that's how our culture, our brains are made for being adjustable in this way. They're designed for it. So that's the role. Am I misunderstanding your question?
We have just two more short questions.
Professor Dennett, I would
Please, for everybody.
I would like to know how would you describe the activity of the little robots inside us to develop coherence. You speak a lot about coherence, and we are very fond about our coherence. But how would this robot respect the principle of coherence? I am...
Good.
Yes.
That's a very good question, and it's one that I've been trying to get a better answer to for the last few years. I've been looking at the literature on neuromodulators and finding a very awkward and disturbing sort of inversion. Again and again, you see theorists writing about, say, dopamine and saying things like, dopamine is the currency of reward. Hang on. Currency is like money, right? Isn't this going in the wrong direction? First of all, if dopamine is money to neurons, what do they buy with it? currency is of no use unless you've got an economy and you're going to have to buy stuff. So currency, it's sort of going in the wrong direction as a metaphor, and yet you think it's also valuable. I mean, everybody, they're saying it, there's got to be a good reason for them to say this, but there's got to be something backwards or wrong about saying this. So I began thinking about, well, okay, what is the economic value of dopamine? To take it at its simplest terms. And you begin to realize that each individual neuron, each little robot, first of all, you have to remember that every neuron is ultimately the direct descendant of free-living, free-swimming, eukaryotic, single-celled protist organisms that fended for themselves for 1 billion years, roughly, before they started making multicellular teams. There's a lot of know-how, a lot of instinct, if you like, that was accumulated over that 1 billion years, and it's probably still in there, or a lot of it is still there to be tapped under circumstances. So we can start thinking of each neuron as a selfish neuron. And it's protecting itself. It's not, its chances of reproduction are virtually nil. So it's like a worker ant, but it's got to protect itself and get fed. It's got metabolic needs, and if its metabolic needs are met variably depending on how well it does, then it has in effect the incentive to send out, you think, it's sending out all these little dendritic feelers to try to, what should I attach to now? And in its myopic little world, it's groping around for connections that will improve its life. And that's what the dopamine is for, because the dopamine enhances the terminals. It permits it to grow more terminals. It gets rich. Now, you make more connections. So it's fighting for influence in its own little sphere. So now we have selfish neurons. They are organized into columns. Interestingly, there's kinship relations. The cells are often the daughter cells of their neighbors. So we have right there the possibility of sort of natural allegiances and differential allegiances between different cells. So we can start thinking of this teamwork of neurons. These, as it's not just random chaos, there's sort of familial relationships, there's cliques, there's specialists, there's reward, and now we just go to Hume's dear friend, Adam Smith, and we say, the invisible hand comes in here, and all these little selfish pin makers are doing their jobs quite myopically, and the coherence can arise from that. That's a just so story, but I think there has to be a story something like that we're going to have to learn how to tell. And then, of course, culture comes in, the memes come in, and proselytize. And they depend for their existence on their ability. A lot of people, when they think about memes, they think just about transmission and differential transmission. What they have to realize is that A meme, when it enters a host, a brain, its first job is to reproduce there, to make lots of descendants in the brain. And so it's got to get itself repeated, and repeated, and repeated. That's how you got your EVM. You practiced. And every rehearsal is another generation. And so the means that work are the ones that get themselves to reproduce in the brain until they've established a sort of critical mass, a beachhead. And they've trained enough neurons so that when their circumstances are right, the neurons all pitch together to make that word happen.
Thank
Yeah, something like that.
Sure, this is a short question.
It's something related, but related to
Louder, please.
other question about free will. Summarizing, I think what I understand of what you said, we can talk about freedom of the self, freedom of us, freedom, and this is different from talking about freedom of the will. I think you talked about the Cartesian supposition of the freedom of the self, the Cartesian self. I think I understand that is a myth. But and what about freedom of the will, or wills, or willing capacities, like Harry Frankfurt's, for example, approach? And I've read your book, Brainstorms, for example, in the chapter of personal identity, and you
Conditions of personality.
you remarked some things about Frankfurt's view on freedom of the will. I'm curious because I don't know if I quite understand quite well your criticism or agreement of Frankfurt's view about the possibility of our wills or willing capacities to be free.
Good. Thank you, Marco. Earlier I mentioned the capacity for reflection, the meta thinking, evaluating our values and so forth. That, I think, is the key notion into understanding the freedom of the will. Now, if we were angels, this would not be a problem. We would automatically be perfect, and we would not only have well-ordered first-leder desires, we wouldn't have any need for second-order desires, because our first-order desires would already be optimally well-ordered. We're not, we're beneath the angels. We're perfect. But we do have the capacity to reflect and to think imaginatively about the desires we find in ourselves. And to think about whether we want to reorganize those. And we've even invented technologies to do that. If you go back, think about Odysseus. He wants to hear the sirens sing. So he arranges to have himself tied to the mast of his boat, and he puts wax in the ears of the sailors so that he can disable himself long enough to satisfy this desire which he realizes would otherwise be dangerous. Notice that the structure of that ploy is very elegant, it's very nice. He's thinking ahead about a time when he anticipates that he will have a suboptimal desire He still wants to satisfy that, he still wants to have that desire, but he wants to constrain himself in advance so that he will not be able to act on it. We do this when we diet, when we try to protect ourselves from our weaker moments in our lives. We learn something about our areas of temptation that are unfortunate, and this is where I think where Frankfurt comes in very well. We're not wantons, what he calls wantons. We have a rich set of higher order desires about our desires, and of course that means we act on them. We are capable of, but you act on a second order desire not by trying harder to. That doesn't work. What we do is we try to put in motion in a cool, reflective moment something which will take us offline when the bad desire crops up. It's these strategies. Now, who has written really brilliantly about this is George Ainsley. His book, Breakdown of Will, is very high on my list of recommended books. It was Ainsley that got me thinking more about selfish neurons and reward, because in Ainsley's view you have all these, what he calls them, interests, and they are warring interests, and they form coalitions. He's got this elaborate machinery of sort of political, economic activity going on inside the brain. And he doesn't know any more than I do how to implement that in brainware, but I think he's got to be on the right track. Does that respond to your issue?
Well, I would like to thank you very much for your presence, and especially to Professor Dennett, who set so much light on those dark issues of the mind. Thank you very much, Professor.
Thank you. Oh, sure, I can do that.
Professor Dennett will be pleased to autograph the books you have in here, if you wish to do so. And also there are some amusements in the table. People feel free to use.
And may I ask you one thing? I tried to speak slowly enough so that you could follow the English. I want to know what should I improve in my efforts to do that? And was there problems with did I speak too fast? No. Should I slow down? Okay. Sometimes I see my American colleagues come to a non-English speaking country and just forget. And it makes me very angry. We're so bad. We only know English.
And if I can say, to close the story at the beginning, finally Dumbo jumps, and the crow speaks, and everybody is afraid. But finally the crowd realized we can fly without wings.
We can fly without wings. Yes.